Well, welcome back to another week's analysis behind the news. Maybe you saw that one of the big things this last week was United States approval for Chinese lender. In other words, what they're talking about is that the Fed has given the permission for China to start coming in and buying United States banks. This does not bode well for the banking industry of the United States, and you'll see why as we go through some of these things that are related to this news. Here is a thing out of the Financial Times this last week. The headline reads, "My Lessons from Life as a Chinese Central Banker." And this individual, Lee, has served on the Central Banking Committee in China, and he talks about this experience, and he does a masterful job of convincing you that you should no longer pay any attention to the investor when it comes to setting interest rates and the availability of loans and that kind of thing. It has to come primarily from the policies of the Central Banking Committee, and oh yes, there is some control from the communist government in China, but it's just as an aside in this article. But it ends up by saying that he says that the renminbi, which is the official monetary system of China, it's not the yuan. The yuan is tied to the renminbi. And he says that for that to become a genuinely international currency, that they're going to have this centralization in China, which they already have, of course. The renminbi is already being used, circulated in all those states surrounding China, with the exception of the Russians. But it's in Mongolia, it's in Cambodia, it's in Vietnam, it's in Thailand, it's in Pakistan, so on and so forth, and recognized as an official currency. So their aim, obviously, is to make it an official international currency. Interrelated with this, you may have seen in the past week that Morgan Bank got into trouble by loaning, again, these risky loans and investments. It's funny, when people make mistakes, they are supposed to suffer the consequences of those mistakes. We do that with our children and everything else, is to teach them a lesson. You don't make dumb decisions, or decisions that are calculated to look dumb in perhaps this case. If you don't allow people to suffer the consequences of their mistakes, what happens? They make more mistakes. In the case of the big banks like Morgan and Chase, they were rewarded with TARP money for these so-called mistakes. It just happens in all of this turmoil that caused the economic turndown, we got new banking regulations, and those new banking regulations rewarded the Morgans and the Chases, while it put more and more of the smaller banks out of business, where they had to merge with the big banks. And some of these things were done with your money and mine through the FICA by bailing them out with federal funds. I mean the depositors, that sort of thing. And then they were merged, all that banking was merged into the bigger banks. And that's really what's going on with all these Fed regulations, is they're designed, if it's deliberate or not, and I think it's deliberate, it's designed to make certain big banks become bigger, ultimately having one bank, and that'll be the Fed, and the little banks are going to disappear gradually. So they were rewarded with TARP money, and some in the trillions, by the way. And some of these figures vary everywhere from 2 trillion up to even 16 trillion. It's astronomical figures. I doubt that it's that high, but those are some of the figures that are floating around. So the thing is that all these mistakes over the past week had led to what? A few resignations, about 3 off of Morgan, but another crescendo that we need more banking regulations in order to insure against these risky loans. And they did that. They passed these laws and regulations to prevent more risky loans, but what did we get after rewarding the banks that made them? More risky loans. So these new regulations will be designed, again, reiterating it, to make the smaller banks suffer, and the bigger banks will keep going the way they always do. One of the things, too, in regard to China is that we see that in spite of all the foreign aid that we send to Colombia, the military aid that we send to Colombia, the armed forces that we are down in Colombia helping them to fight the FARC drug cartel and everything else, they're going to start sending more oil to China. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, an untold story of what is going on is that United States refineries are shutting down. More and more of them, from Sunoco and ExxonMobil and Hess, are shutting down more and more oil refineries. In fact, a couple of those are even going out of the business entirely because of the regulations that they have to deal with in the United States. It's just not profitable for them anymore. Another thing in regard to the Chinese, we talked in the last couple of weeks about the Chinese moving into the South Pacific with your money and ours to buy up the governments and buy up the citizenry with all sorts of perks and so on and so forth. Now the Chinese are trying to buy up tracts of land in Michigan, for instance. Here's the Dayton Daily News, where it says that the southeastern Michigan city of Milan, a 40-minute or so commute to the Toledo or Detroit industrial centers, might become the new home for a 200-acre or larger China city that would house Chinese business people. In other words, they want to start building an enclave and have the Chinese and businessmen and students and everything else living there while they attend college and do business in the area. That's to prevent them from coming in contact in their off time, their leisure time, with American influences. There might be something even more sinister involved. They're trying to do the same with a 50 square mile tract in Boise, just south of Boise, Idaho. So we're starting to see these things coming about. We don't know how many more instances this may be occurring across the country, but these are two that we know of. The problem that I have with it is, if they are building these things, what kind of immunity from local laws will there be where they're located? Will they be under the jurisdiction of the local sheriff or not? Will they be under the jurisdiction of the federal government or not? Will they become sovereign property of the Chinese government or not? We don't know. But even in this from the standpoint of building these enclaves to keep these Chinese isolated from the community, I also have to ask the question in times of war, because you always have to think about these things. If the Chinese government their army has declared that the United States is the enemy and we're going to have to defeat them, and that's what their military is saying, are the military personnel of China going to be here as well? If they are, what will they use these enclaves for? I think it's a serious question that begs an answer. Meanwhile, we see that our foreign involvement in these countries, such as Iraq, is not worked out. We're withdrawing from Iraq, and now what we see from the New York Times is that the United States may jettison efforts to train Iraq police units. It's not going very well. We've hired policemen to go over and train these Iraqis into a national police for the Iraqis. That in and of itself is a problem. A national police enforces the national government. It doesn't enforce local laws. It isn't beholden to the local people. It's beholden to the national government. Anyway, it's not working out. We had a Bircher that went over in the euphoria of the fall of Baghdad and tried to help train Iraqi forces, and found out that he couldn't trust them, he said. That they were telling the other side what was going on. For instance, if they went out for a raid against known terrorists, somehow or another these terrorists knew they were coming and were prepared. So they stopped telling the Iraqis that they were coming in. So as soon as they got there and they found out what was going on, when the Iraqis got off the truck, the first thing they did was get on their cell phones and tell everybody we're coming in. So they took the cell phones away. But at any rate, those are the sorts of things that go on over there, and now we find that training their police is not working out. It doesn't work. We could have told them that before we went in there, but nobody was listening. They still don't. But these are the things that we're starting to see happening. More and more China is moving in and surrounding the United States. Now they're looking for enclaves within the United States, both in banking and physically. It doesn't bode well for the future. It's time to get involved. It's time to organize in your local communities. And the best way you can do that, simply get involved with the John Birch Society. Until next week, we'll see you then.